Have you ever wondered if courts just have to blindly defer to your HOA's interpretation of the rules simply because the board claims they acted in quote-unquote good faith? Well, welcome to this Public Interest Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really critical case that directly answers that exact question. Whether you're a homeowner trying to make sense of your rights, a volunteer board member, a researcher, or an advocate for the Arizona HOA Transparency Project, this explainer is absolutely for you. We're going to look closely at what happens when a petty neighborhood dispute over stucco and exposed wires forces the courts to step in and decide who actually holds the power in a community association. First up, just a quick disclaimer. What we're looking at today is public record, education, and commentary, right? This is not legal advice. The case we're diving into is Johnson v. Pointe Community Association. It's a 2003 decision from the Arizona Court of Appeals Division 1. The official case names David and Wendee Johnson, they're the plaintiffs and appellants here, who essentially sued their homeowners association, the Pointe Community Association, as well as their neighbors, Patrick and Carol Boyle. Okay, let's dive into this. We've got a quick roadmap to help us make sense of this crucial Arizona HOA precedent. First, we'll cover the neighborhood conflict. Then, the paper trail, the core legal issue, what the court actually decided, and we'll wrap up with the practical lessons for both homeowners and HOA boards. Part 1, the neighborhood conflict. You know, it's wild how these massive legal battles usually start with the most ordinary, relatable situations. We're not talking about millions and embezzled funds here. This was quite literally a dispute over backyard landscaping. Back in December 1999, the Boyles decided to do some backyard renovations. They put up a trellis, they changed their exterior patio stucco from rough to smooth, and during that process, they moved an electrical conduit line and just left it exposed. Well, the Johnsons, who lived right next door, were not happy about this, so in January 2000, they sent a formal complaint to the HOA, and the HOA then notified the Boyles that, hey, you need prior approval for exterior changes. Over the next few months, the architectural committee got involved, but while they dealt with the trellis, they kind of just let the stucco and the wiring slide. In fact, the board just told the Boyles to paint the exposed electrical conduit Navajo white to match the house and called it a day. The Johnsons felt the HOA was completely ignoring the community's strict rules, and by May 2001, after months of back and forth, bam, they filed a lawsuit. 18 months of escalating tension over stucco and wires led right to the courthouse steps. Moving on to Part 2, the paper trail. In the HOA world, verbal promises or casual hallway conversations mean almost nothing. The documentation is absolutely everything. Just look at the intense paper trail this situation generated. The Johnsons didn't just sue their neighbors, they sued their HOA for breach of contract and breach of fiduciary duty. Why? Because an HOA's governing documents, the CC&Rs, form a legally binding contract between the property owners and the association. The Johnsons argued that by failing to strictly enforce the rules on that stucco and the wiring, the HOA board actually breached its contractual duty to the homeowners. To really hammer their point home, the Johnsons pointed right to Section 3.9 of the Community's Declaration. It explicitly says, "No changes which in any way affects or alters the exterior appearance shall be initiated without the prior written approval of the Architectural Committee." The record clearly showed the Architectural Committee never formally approved that stucco change. And on top of that, the HOA's own rules required electrical lines to be concealed, yet the board just said, paid over it. The Johnsons had the paper trail on their side. They had the written rules, and they had the lack of written approval. All right, Part 3, the core legal issue. So here is the real climax of the conflict. When this finally hit the trial court, the HOA threw out a defense that, honestly, if it had been allowed to stand, would have drastically shifted the balance of power in Arizona HOAs. The HOA argued, and get this, the trial court initially agreed, that courts should just defer to the association's decisions. The HOA's claim was basically, as long as the board handled the complaints in good faith, meaning they looked into it and made a judgment call, the court had no business second-guessing them. And the trial court actually dismissed the Johnsons' case based on that exact logic. Think about how wildly dangerous that precedent would be for homeowners. It effectively meant a board could ignore their own written rules so long as they could shrug and say they were acting in good faith. But the Johnsons weren't giving up. They appealed, which set up this huge legal showdown. You have the trial court saying courts should defer to HOA decisions made in good faith. But then the appellate court steps in and completely strikes that down. They firmly stated that the interpretation of restrictive covenants is a question of law for the court to decide, and absolutely zero deference is given to the HOA's interpretation. The homeowners won the appeal because the higher court recognized a fundamental truth. A contract is a contract.
Which brings us to part 4, what the court decided.
Let's really unpack what Judge Snow and the appellate court actually ruled when it comes to this whole idea of judicial deference. In a landmark quote from the opinion, Judge Snow wrote, "The civil courts afford a neutral interpretation of the development's declaration and significant protection against overreaching by either homeowners or their association." This is incredibly powerful stuff. It means CC&Rs are interpreted neutrally by courts as a matter of law. They are not domains for blind board deference. The court explicitly rejected the idea that a board's factual findings or informal little waivers carry any special weight in a courtroom. The HOA has to comply with the declaration, and members are absolutely entitled to judicial recourse to make sure that compliance happens.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the financial sting attached to it. $4,560. When the trial court originally dismissed the Johnsons' lawsuit, it punished them by awarding the Boyles $4,560 in attorney fees, literally forcing the Johnsons to pay just for trying to enforce the community rules. But because the appellate court completely reversed the trial court's ruling, they specifically vacated this attorney fee award.
So what is the actual final procedural status of this case? Let's be strictly accurate here. The appellate court vacated and remanded the case. In plain English, that means they wiped out the trial court's incorrect legal ruling about deference and sent the whole thing back down to the lower court to figure out the actual facts. The appellate court didn't officially decide if the Boyles had to tear down their stucco. They just ruled that the trial court actually has to listen to the evidence and decide the case based on the contract, without just blindly trusting the HOA's good faith excuse.
Part 5, lessons for homeowners.
Let's pivot to the practical takeaways here. If you're a homeowner dealing with selective enforcement or a totally dismissive HOA, this precedent is a massive shield for your rights. First, remember that courts neutrally interpret CC&Rs. Second, a board's factual determinations get absolutely no deference. If your board says, well, we investigated and found no violation, a judge doesn't just have to take their word for it. And third, members can sue to enforce the declaration themselves. An HOA board cannot just wave away the rules, like telling someone to paint over an unauthorized wire, and expect a judge to back them up. If the rules say conceal the wire, it has to be concealed, period. If you ever find yourself in a similar dispute, here is a practical evidence checklist for you. First, look at architectural applications. Was the change formally submitted in writing? In the Pointe case, the stucco change actually wasn't. Second, check for written board approvals. The Pointe rules specifically required 2 signatures from the architectural committee to be valid. An informal nod from a single board member just doesn't cut it. Check your own CC&Rs for those signature requirements. And third, developer versus owner install. The HOA tried to argue the exposed wire was originally placed by the developer, which would have exempted it. But the Johnsons brought receipts. They had evidence the homeowner installed it. Always track exactly who did the work and when.
And finally, part 6. Lessons for HOA boards.
Okay, let's switch gears. What do volunteer boards, attorneys, and management companies need to learn from this incredibly expensive litigation? The compliance lessons are stark. Number 1, you simply cannot informally waive CC&R requirements. You can't just tell a homeowner, hey, don't worry about it, if the rules strictly require approval. Number 2, good faith does not excuse a breach of contract. Trying to be neighborly by ignoring a violation actually exposes your entire association to massive legal liability from the other homeowners. And number 3, require written approvals for all exterior changes, exactly as your governing documents dictate. You have to follow the strict letter of your own law. So the crucial point to remember here is understanding the limits of this case. This appellant ruling does not officially prove that the Boyles violated the rules, and it doesn't say the HOA committed fraud or intentional misconduct. What it proves is procedural. The trial court must independently decide if a violation occurred based on the actual evidence. The courts are the ultimate neutral umpire. The HOA board is not. Which leaves us with this final, really vital question to ask about your own neighborhood. Is your HOA enforcing the strict letter of the governing documents, or are they relying on informal fixes and just assuming the courts will blindly defer to their authority? Johnson v. Pointe Community Association proves that when push comes to shove, the exact text of your community's contract is what truly matters. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking the right questions about your community's governance.